Tommy Smith with Rattle and HumSports.com. We're here at Boomer Jacks in Arlington. I want to say thank you. We're hosting our Big 12 Extra Show with Kevin Lonnquist. Kevin, thanks a lot for joining us again.
Always a pleasure.
I'm going to start out like we do and talk about the highlights of the Big 12 action last week. Two games that we mentioned, UT and Ole Miss, TCU and Kansas, Kevin. What did you take from the TCU-Kansas game, first of all?
Well, I thought that Kansas played about as hard as it possibly could. First time for them to really measure themselves against a named program in TCU. Charlie Weiss's program wanted to get off to a good start, and they did. Go down to kick a field goal on one of their opening possessions. They stopped TCU on a couple of fumbles inside their red zone. Their defense played as hard as they could, but they just don't have enough personnel to match up with the Horned Frogs, and TCU winds up winning the game 20-6. I think the one thing as far as the Horned Frogs are concerned is that they got a little taste as to what life is going to be like in the road in the Big 12, from the standpoint that they have to make sure that they understand all the hostile environments that they're going to be in. They're going to be on the road 4 more times this year. They're going to be going to West Virginia. They're going to be going to Austin. And so those are a little bit different than maybe going to Colorado State and New Mexico. Gary Patterson has probably made his team very well aware of that. The Horned Frogs did what they needed to do to win the game in spite of the turnovers. Casey Paul was very efficient again running the offense. And the one thing also that stood out was Brandon Carter, one of their top recruits from the 2011 class, stood out and had a huge breakout game for them. I love this kid. I think he's going to be one of the bell cow receivers of that team. And TCU takes care of business in Lawrence. The Texas game at Ole Miss, what I thought stood out for me, of course, was the way that David Ash played. David throwing for a career-high 326 yards, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. He hasn't thrown an interception this year. That was important as far as his development was concerned. Now, Ole Miss is not going to be confused with Alabama. Let's don't kid ourselves here. But when you go on the road and win at night at an SEC opponent, it may not be the challenge that some people thought it was going to be, but the fact is that Texas took another step. The one drawback for the Longhorns is that this defense, as the buildup that it is still getting throughout the course of the year, still missing some tackles. Players are taking bad angles, especially in the secondary. Mack Brown has spoken about that, plus the fact they are still giving up big plays, which is where you're getting the missed tackles and the bad angles. The big plays, this defense is still susceptible to surrendering it, so they're going to have to work on that. They've got 2 weeks to figure it out before they go up to Stillwater to play Oklahoma State.
We had some tremendous news in the conference last week. Let's start first of all. Some news breaking yesterday out of TCU. Raymond James looks like he's going to miss the rest of the season with a knee injury. You talk a little bit about that and what that means for the Horned Frogs moving forward.
Yeah, it's a tough loss for TCU because Wayman had really gotten off to a good start this year, was averaging well over or nearly 10 yards a carry in the limited times that he was getting the touches. But the one thing that Gary Patterson likes to do with his running backs is distribute the wealth between him, now Matthew Tucker, who's going to be the primary back in this offense. And Wayman was going to take on the role that Ed Wesley had left when Ed left school back in the spring. It's a devastating blow. I feel bad for him because you never like to see kids go down with injuries. It changes the dynamic. It really puts a lot of stress on the depth of that position for them because the fact they were already playing a freshman in B.J. Catalon. And I think what the TCU coaches were trying to do was kind of feed B.J. into this offense methodically, give him a few carries here, a few carries there, and then maybe sometime in October, later in October, and even into November, maybe he gets more of the workload to spell Tucker and to spell James. Now that all flips because the fact that you have James out of the lineup, you have Tucker now as your go-to guy, as your primary ball carrier, and now you have BJ moving up. Andre Dean will get some more carries now as a part of this. It's a pretty deep position for the Horned Frogs. It's not one of their deepest, but it's a position that you're going to see how the Horned Frogs respond to this. Not this weekend when they play Virginia, but probably in the middle of October when they're playing the likes of Oklahoma State, Kansas State, and things of that nature. The other injury that comes up, though, is that Oklahoma State also lost their quarterback, Wes Lunt, to an injury against Louisiana Lafayette last week. Mike Gundy said on the Big 12 coaches call earlier in the week, they just don't know if he will be ready to play against Texas. J.W. Walsh, who's the other freshman quarterback that's seen a lot of playing time this year, played pretty well against Lafayette. They're just going to have to take it day by day with Lunt to see if he's going to be able to play. Fortunately, it doesn't look like it's an ACL injury for him. But again,
They've got 2 weeks. The Cowboys are off this week, and so we'll just kind of have to wait and see toward the middle of next week to see how Lunt is going to be ready for that ball game, if he will be ready for that ball game.
Other big news of the week, maybe not so much from the Big 12, but concerns the Big 12 and the announcement of the ACC and their relationship with Notre Dame going forward. You had mentioned on RattleHomeSports.com a little bit about what that might mean for the conference. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means for the Big 12 going forward?
Sure. We talked about this last week, the fact that the conference probably won't be in a position to expand. And I still believe that. And I think there's a couple things that have happened from the fallout of Notre Dame joining the ACC, is the fact that if you're the Big 12 and you look at the way things are shifting right now in the college athletics landscape, I think what Notre Dame's move does is that it kind of locks a lot of these conferences into each other. And so if you're the Big 12, where are you going to try and go grab from if you want to expand? Sure, you could look at Louisville and Cincinnati, but as I mentioned last week, the only attractive candidate between those two, and then if you add Boise State and BYU into it, is really Louisville. And I don't know if that's really where you really want to take this conference right now. And that's not a slight against Louisville, because it's a great overall athletic program. The women's basketball team got to a Final Four. Baseball team has had some great success. Obviously, Rick Pitino's done a great job with the basketball program, and now football is coming back with Charlie Strong. But again, if you're the Big 12, and if you really want to go somewhere, your best choice is looking at the ACC. Well, that was kind of flirted with in the spring and in the early summer with Florida State, Georgia Tech, and Clemson. Now with the ACC locking down with the Orange Bowl, the addition of Notre Dame, plus the fact you've got the television deal that may not be as lucrative as the one that the Big 12 just signed, but still revenue generating enough so that the conference will still be well compensated for it from an individual school standpoint. I just don't know where the Big 12 is going to go. So I personally think that the conference is going to sit pat for the next couple of years, kind of wait and see how things shake out. Once the new bowl, or I should say the new playoff system gets started in 2014, and even DeLoss Dodds, the Texas athletic director, has mentioned the fact that you might see some of these conferences that are having conference championship games that first weekend in December do away with those, because what kind of sense is that when you have teams that are playing each other for the right to go to the playoff? They may look at each other and say, why are we doing this? It's a pretty good point. And I think that's something that we'll have to kind of watch to develop over the next several years.
We kind of have maybe a short schedule of the conference, this week with a few teams off, and it's really the last weekend before we really get into conference play. But let's pick out some games that maybe you're looking at this weekend to take note of.
Well, the first one that stands out the first one for me is Friday night. That'll be Baylor at Louisiana Monroe. And of course, Monroe has caught the attention of the nation with its upset win over Arkansas in overtime, and then going to Auburn last week and taking the Tigers to overtime before losing in overtime. So Baylor's coming into an arena where I think back on September 1st, no one was really looking at this game as being a really difficult contest for the Bears. Now there's a lot of scrutiny all over this. You'll probably see a better ratings bump for ESPN than even ESPN wanted. But it's going to be a good test for the Bears, because now they're going to walk into an environment, small stadium, Malone Stadium's about 20,000 in capacity, so they're going to have to make sure that they handle that. Of course, Baylor's played on the road in a lot of Big 12 venues where it's going to be a hostile environment. Art Briles will have his kids ready to play. I think the emotion and the fervor on a Friday night with national television being the only game played that night, where Monroe has a chance to really kind of sell itself. If Baylor can survive the first quarter of emotion, both offensively and defensively, what the Warhawks do, I think they'll be fine as far as that's concerned. A couple of other games that stand out to me will be, let's go on the East Coast there with West Virginia and Maryland. That's a regional rivalry for folks who don't follow West Virginia or know much about them, but that's a series that's about 50 years old. 49th meeting this weekend. It'll be in Morgantown. West Virginia won a tight game there last year by 6 points. Didn't have much of a running game to speak of, but this is a pretty good rivalry between the Mountaineers and the Terrapins. A lot of people think of West Virginia's natural rivalry is with Pitt, and it is, but few people seem to think, or few people seem to know how intense that rivalry is between those two squads. And as Dana Holgerson has said, they see Maryland a lot on the recruiting trail, so they're going to be interested. There's going to be a lot of interest in that game. Maryland's got a very good running defense. West Virginia's going to have to establish itself. Plus the fact you're going to have Geno Smith, who's off to a tremendous start, making a case for the Heisman Trophy. He's already completed 82% of his passes this year. Granted, that's against Marshall and James Madison, but he's that special of a player. And when you're completing against 82%, even if you were playing sandlot ball, that's really good stuff. He's just an exceptional talent. He's got a wealth of wide receivers to work with. He'll get tested by Maryland this week. I think West Virginia will prevail. And then finally, the big game to open up the conference season, even though we had Kansas and TCU last week, though, will be in Norman Saturday night, national television on Fox, with Kansas State visiting Norman. Great matchup there between Bob Stoops and Bill Snyder. Their heritage takes each other back to when they were at Iowa, when Bob was a defensive back for the Hawkeyes and Bill Snyder was on Hayden Fry's staff as an assistant coach. And those two crossed paths when Bill got the job at Kansas State in the early 90s, and then he brought Bob in as a defensive backs coach and then promoted Bob to a co-defensive coordinator in 1991. So there's been a great crossover between a lot of the Oklahoma coaches and with Bill. Of course, some of those coaches have moved on, but it's always great. I think this game is going to get decided in the trenches. Oklahoma, as we've talked about before on Rattle and Hum Sports, and as has been well chronicled throughout the media, lost 2 offensive linemen to injuries. Kyle Evans and Ben Hayburn out with injuries for the year. Ben Hayburn had to give up football because of his back injuries, so that hurt them in the depth. Kansas State, they've had some problems with their pass rush. They allowed the North Texas quarterbacks to complete 25 of 28 passes and weren't able to really put a lot of heat on him. So the question is going to be can the weakness of each side, Oklahoma's offensive line, handle Kansas State's suspect defensive line? If they can, then Oklahoma should be in good shape. If they can find a way to harass, the Kansas State defensive line can harass Landry Jones enough, then Kansas State will put itself in a position to stay in this ballgame and maybe have a chance to win it. I still like Oklahoma to win it because it's very hard to win in Norman, but I think Kansas State has a shot of being in this football game.
And one last thing, one of the great features on the site is we'd love to look at your power rankings, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. Let's just say top 5 right now in the conference. Give us your top 5.
Well, right now I have West Virginia number 1. I still think they're the most talented team. Of course, their defense is going to be really tested once they hit the conference season, and that'll be next week. Number 2, I have Oklahoma. I still think the Sooners are, just on paper, still one of the better teams in the conference. Number 3, I have Texas. I really like the way, number 3, I have Kansas State. Number 4, I have Texas. I think they took a big step, but at the same time, there's still more work to do. And then number 5, I have TCU. Horned Frogs got off to a good start. They won the game they were supposed to win. Now they've only given up 6 points, and people could argue, have you really played anyone? And we probably won't know that about TCU really until they hit the Big 12 schedule in October. But this is still a very talented program that Gary Patterson has built, and so they're worthy of the top 5.
And we will be out there Saturday at 11 to cover that game against Virginia. Looking forward to your coverage. Thanks a lot for joining us again this week. Look forward to doing it again next week.
My pleasure, Tommy.